The migration period, better known as the barbarian invasions and also referred to as the Völkerwanderung, was a period of intensified barbarian invasion in Europe, often defined from the period when it seriously impacted the Roman world, as running from about 376 to 800 AD during the transition from late antiquity to the early Middle Ages. This period was marked by profound changes both within the Roman Empire and beyond its barbarian frontier. The barbarians who came first were Germanic tribes such as the Goths, Vandals, Angles, Saxons, Lombards, Suebi, Frisi, Jutes and Franks. They were later pushed westwards by the Huns, Avars, Slavs, Bulgars and Alans. Later barbarian invasions also had significant effects, however, they are outside the scope of the migration period. Chronology. Origins of Germanic tribes. Germanic peoples moved out of southern Scandinavia and Germany to the adjacent lands between the Elbe and Oder after 1000 BC. The first wave moved westward and southward and moving into southern Germany up to the Roman provinces of Gaul and Cisalpine Gaul by 100 BC, where they were stopped by Gaius Marius and Julius Caesar. It is this western group which was described by the Roman historian Tacitus and Julius Caesar. A later wave of Germanic tribes migrated eastward and southward from Scandinavia between 600 and 300 BC to the opposite coast of the Baltic Sea, moving up the Vistula near the Carpathians. During Tacitus' era they included lesser-known tribes such as the Tencteri, Cherish, Hermunduri and Chatti. However, a period of federation and intermarriage resulted in the familiar groups known as the Alemanni, Franks, Saxons, Frisians and Thuringians. First phase. The barbarian invasions may be divided into two phases. The first phase, occurring between AD 300 and 500, is partly documented by Greek and Latin historians but difficult to verify archaeologically. It put Germanic peoples in control of most areas of the then Western Roman Empire. The Tervingi entered Roman territory in 376. Sometime thereafter in Marcianopolis, the escort to Fratigen was killed while meeting with Lupicinus. The Tervingi rebelled, and the Visigoths, a group derived either from the Tervingi or from a fusion of mainly Gothic groups, eventually invaded Italy and sacked Rome in 410, before settling in Gaul, and then, 50 years later, in Iberia, founding a kingdom that lasted for 250 years. They were followed into Roman territory first by a confederation of Herulian, Rugian, and Syrian warriors, under Odoacer, that deposed Romulus Augustulus on 4 September AD 476, and later by the Ostrogoths, led by Theodoric the Great, who settled in Italy. In Gaul the Franks entered Roman lands gradually during the 5th century, and after consolidating power under Childeric and his son Clovis's decisive victory over Syagrius in 486, established themselves as rulers of northern Rome and Gaul, fending off challenges from the Alemanni, Burgundians, and Visigoths. The Frankish kingdom became the nucleus of the future France and Germany. The initial Anglo-Saxon settlement of Britain occurred during the 5th century, when Roman-controlled Britain had come to an end. The Burgundians settled in northwestern Italy, Switzerland and eastern France in the 5th century. Second phase. The second phase took place between 500 and 700 and saw Slavic tribes settling in Central and Eastern Europe, gradually making it predominantly Slavic. Additionally, Turkic tribes such as the Avars became involved in this phase. In 567, the Avars and the Lombards destroyed much of the Gepid kingdom. The Lombards, a Germanic people, settled in Italy with their Herulian, Suebian, Gepid, Thuringian, Bulgarian, Sarmatian and Saxon allies in the 6th century. They were later followed by the Bavarians and the Franks, who conquered and ruled most of Italy. The Bulgars, originally a Turkic group from Central Asia, had occupied the Pontic steppe north of Caucasus since the 2nd century, but after pushed by the Khazars, the majority of them migrated west and dominated Byzantine territories along the lower Danube in the 7th century. During the early Byzantine Arab Wars, Arab armies attempted to invade southeast Europe via Asia Minor during the late 7th and early 8th centuries, but were defeated at the Siege of Constantinople by the joint forces of Byzantium and the Bulgars. During the Khazar-Arab Wars, the Khazars stopped the Arab expansion into Europe across the Caucasus. At the same time, the Moors, Arabs and Berbers invaded Europe via Gibraltar, before being halted. These battles broadly demarcated the frontiers between Christendom and Islam for the next millennium. The following centuries saw the Muslims successful in conquering most of Sicily from the Christians by 902. The Hungarian conquest of the Carpathian Basin from around 895, and the Viking expansion from the late 8th century conventionally marked the last large movements of the period. Christianity gradually converted the non-Islamic newcomers and integrated them into the medieval Christian order. Climatic factors. A number of contemporary historical references worldwide refer to an extended period of extreme weather during 535 to 536. Evidence of this cold period is also found in dendrochronology and ice cores. The consequences of this cold period are debated. Discussions. Barbarian identity. The analysis of barbarian identity and how it was created and expressed during the barbarian invasions has elicited discussion among scholars. Herwig Wolfram, in discussing the equation of migratio gentium with Völkerwanderung, observes that Michael Schmidt introduced the equation in his 1778 History of the Germans. Wolfram observed that the significance of gens as a biological community was shifting even during the early Middle Ages. To complicate matters, we have no way of devising a terminology that is not derived from the concept of nationhood created during the French Revolution. The primordialistic paradigm prevailed during the 19th century. Scholars such as German linguist Johann Gottfried Herder view tribes as coherent biological entities, using the term to refer to discrete ethnic groups. He believed that the folk were an organic whole, with a core identity and spirit evident in art, literature and language. These were seen as intrinsic characteristics unaffected by external influences, even conquest. Language, in particular, was seen as the most important expression of ethnicity. They argued that groups sharing the same language possessed a common identity and ancestry. The Romantic ideal that there had once been a single German, Celtic or Slavic people who originated from a common homeland and spoke a common tongue helped provide a conceptual framework for political movements of the 18th and 19th centuries such as Pan-Germanism and Pan-Slavism. Beginning in the 1960s, a reinterpretation of archaeological and historic evidence prompted scholars to propose new models for explaining the construction of barbarian identity, maintaining that no sense of shared identity was perceived by the Germani. A similar theory has been proposed for Celtic and Slavic groups. This theory states that the primordialist mode of thinking was encouraged by a prima facie interpretation of Greco-Roman sources, which grouped together many tribes under such labels as Germani, Celtois or Sklavnoi. Modernists argue that the uniqueness perceived by specific groups was based on common political and economic interests, rather than biological or racial distinctions. The role of language in constructing and maintaining group identity can be ephemeral, since large-scale language shifts occur commonly in history. Modernists propose the idea of imagined communities. The barbarian polities in late antiquity were social constructs, rather than changeless lines of blood kinship. The process of forming tribal units was called ethnogenesis, a term coined by Soviet scholar Julian Bromley. The Austrian school popularized this idea, which influenced medievalists such as Herwig Wolfram, Walter Pohl and Patrick Geary. It argues that the stimulus for forming tribal polities was perpetuated by a small nucleus of people, known as the Traditionskern, who were a military or aristocratic elite. This core group formed a standard for larger units, gathering adherents by employing amalgamative metaphors such as kinship and aboriginal commonality and claiming that they perpetuated an ancient, divinely sanctioned lineage. The common, track-filled map of the Völkerwanderung may illustrate such a course of events, but it misleads. Unfolded over long periods of time, the changes of position that took place were necessarily irregular, periods of emphatic discontinuity. For decades and possibly centuries, the tradition bearers idled, and the tradition itself hibernated. There was ample time for forgetfulness to do its work. Complementary forces to the barbarian invasions. Historians have postulated several explanations for the appearance of barbarians on the Roman frontier: weather and crops, population pressure, a primeval urge to push into the Mediterranean, or the domino effect. Entire barbarian tribes flooded into Roman provinces, ending classical urbanism and beginning new types of rural settlements. In general, French and Italian scholars have tended to view this as a catastrophic event, the destruction of a civilization and the beginning of a dark age which set Europe back a millennium. In contrast, German and English historians have tended to see it as the replacement of a tired, effete and decadent Mediterranean civilization, with a more virile, martial, Nordic one. The scholar Guy Halsall has seen the barbarian movement as the result of the fall of the Roman Empire, not as its cause. Archaeological finds have confirmed that Germanic and Slavic tribes were settled agriculturalists who were probably merely drawn into the politics of an empire already falling apart for quite a few other causes. The crisis of the 3rd century caused significant changes within the Roman Empire, in both its western and eastern portions. In particular, economic fragmentation removed many of the political, cultural and economic forces which had held the empire together. The rural population in Roman provinces became distanced from the metropolis, and there was little to differentiate them from other peasants across the Roman frontier. In addition, Rome increasingly used foreign mercenaries to defend itself. This barbarization of the empire was paralleled by changes within Barbaricum. For example, the Roman Empire played a vital role in building up barbarian groups along its frontier. Propped up with imperial support and gifts, the armies of allied barbarian chieftains served as buffers against hostile barbarian groups. The disintegration of Roman economic power weakened groups that had come to depend on Roman gifts for the maintenance of their own power. With the arrival of the Huns, this prompted many groups to invade the provinces for economic reasons. The nature of the barbarian takeover of former Roman provinces varied from region to region. For example, in Aquitaine the provincial administration was largely self-reliant. Halsall has argued that local rulers simply handed over military rule to the Ostrogoths, acquiring the identity of the newcomers. In Gaul, the collapse of imperial rule resulted in anarchy. The Franks and Alemanni were pulled into the ensuing power vacuum, resulting in conflict. In Spain, local aristocrats maintained independent rule for some time, raising their own armies against the Vandals. Meanwhile, the Roman withdrawal from lowland England resulted in conflict between Saxons and the Brythonic chieftains. The Eastern Roman Empire attempted to maintain control of the Balkan provinces, despite her thinly spread imperial army that relied mainly on local militias and an extensive effort to refortify the Danubian limes. The ambitious fortification efforts collapsed, worsening the impoverished conditions of the local populace and resulting in colonization by Slavic warriors and their families. Halsall and Noble have argued that such changes stemmed from the breakdown in Roman political control, which exposed the weakness of local Roman rule. Instead of large-scale migrations, there were military takeovers by small groups of warriors and their families. This process involved active, conscious decision-making by Roman provincial populations. The collapse of centralized control severely weakened the sense of Roman identity in the provinces, which may explain why the provinces underwent dramatic cultural changes at this time even though few barbarians settled in them. Ultimately, the Germanic groups in the Western Roman Empire were accommodated without dispossessing or overturning indigenous society, and maintained a structured and hierarchical form of Roman administration. Ironically, they lost their unique identity as a result of this accommodation and were absorbed into Latinhood. In contrast, in the East, Slavic tribes maintained a more Spartan and egalitarian existence bound to the land, even in times when they took their part in plundering Roman provinces. Their organizational models were not Roman, and their leaders were not normally dependent on Roman gold for success. Thus, they arguably had a greater effect on their region than the Goths, Franks or Saxons had on theirs. Ethnicity based on the belief that particular types of artifacts are thought to indicate the race or ethnicity of the person buried. The culture history school of archaeology assumed that archaeological cultures represent the heimat of tribal polities named in historical sources. As a consequence, the shifting extensions of material cultures were interpreted as the expansion of peoples. Influenced by constructionism, process-driven archaeologists rejected the culture-historical doctrine. They marginalized the discussion of ethnicity altogether, and focused on the intra-group dynamics which generated such material remains. Moreover, they argued that adoption of new cultures could occur through trade or internal political developments rather than military takeovers. Depiction in media. Terry Jones' Barbarians, a 4-part TV documentary series first broadcast on BBC Two in 2006. Rome. Total War. Barbarian Invasion and Total War. Attila. Turn-based strategy games by the Creative Assembly. Detailed map.